forgot. The universal translator's on the fritz again, and Lamar hasn't come in to fix it. So I guess we were going to do this whole episode in Whistlespeak, but probably for the best, we're going to do it in general basic. So welcome to the latest episode of the Union Federation podcast here on the Fandom Podcast Network and the BQN Network. Of course, this is the show that covers everything that's happening in Star Trek and the Orville. And right now, everything is about the final season of Star Trek Discovery, which means we're going to be talking about season 5, episode 6 of Discovery, Whistlespeak. But you know what? I can't whistle all by myself. I need a couple extra people because that's a lot. That's a lot of oxygen. And I need to take time to catch my breath. So I found a couple people I think can help me out. Of course, one is our ship's counselor and also an awesome holographic captain herself, the wonderful board queen of the BQN, Amy Nelson.
I tried my best.
Well, you gave it an effort. I feel like there's some close encounters in our future, which means in case they get violent, I need somebody who's going to be on the weapons console at all times, plus ready with the sciencey stuff too, because I always need somebody to science the you-know-what out of this. And I can't think of anybody better than, of course, the legendary Haley Stoddard.
Water. It's so parched. Need water.
Wait, I told you not to have that cube. I told you. You were warned.
I mean, technically, I really don't need it because it's my autoimmune. But I will say, preface really quick. When they took that, I was like, hey, now they know how I feel all the time. Anyway, I'm happy to be here. Super excited.
Yeah, we are going to have a lot of fun as always here on the Union Federation podcast as we are marching through the final episodes of Star Trek Discovery. I can't believe we've only got just a few left. This season feels like it has flown by, but it's been an interesting one, and we're gonna talk about what I thought was one of the better episodes of this season, in my opinion. I'll be curious to see what everybody else on the crew has to say. But of course, you can find the Union Federation not only on the Fandom Podcast Network, where if you're listening to us on our audio feeds or watching on our YouTube channel, we greatly appreciate it. And of course, too, you can find the Union Federation podcast on the BQN, where they just assimilate everything, including the audio. You're assimilating books now, I hear, Amy.
Yes, we do have Trek Book Club is our newest podcast, so be checking that out.
Yeah, soon we're all going to be just green and bowing to the BQN queen. So
assimilate the audio.
And of course, we are in the last season of Star Trek Discovery with that awful good-looking crew. Guys, I guess got to say, I love the uniforms of this season. Mm-hmm. They're sharp, and book is always just dressed to the nines anyway. So yeah, we're good there. We just can't. I still can't believe it's going this fast. It's crazy, but guys, we have a very interesting episode this week. It's been a while, I feel like, since we've had something that's really dealt with Discovery, at least with the Prime Directive. And I know that was a big part of this week's episode. But you know what? Let's get right into it. Let's warp out into our first away mission. And of course, that means spoiler alert. We are going to be diving deep into this latest episode of Star Trek Discovery, Whistlespeak. So if you have not had a chance to watch the episode yet, go watch it, come back, make sure you watch the Ready Room too. Very interesting episode of the Ready Room. We're going to be talking about that a little later on. But yeah, one of the more interesting episodes of Discovery this season. So we are into our first away mission, which means that we are going to be talking about Whistlespeak. And it means that it's time for the Admiral's Log episode synopsis. Which one of you here has had enough to drink that you feel like you can read the Admiral's Log this week?
I'm good.
Amy, if you would.
All right. Well, we get Kovich, who identifies the 5 scientists who hid the map pieces, allowing Discovery to determine that the next clue is pointing to a Denobulan weather tower on, oh man, I remember. Halemno. Thank you. I was watching it and I'm like, I need to remember how to say this. Halemno, which holds off deadly sandstorms and provides rain. The tower is concealed as a mountain to hide the advanced technology from the Hellemnites, a pre-warp society that should not be interfered with per Starfleet's Prime Directive. Burnham and Tilly join the Hellemnites in disguise. With help from Adira, Burnham repairs the tower's malfunctioning control panel, while Tilly participates in a race to gain access to the tower. She and one of the Hellemnites, Rava, win the race and are locked inside the tower as sacrifices to the Hellemnite gods. Burnham violates the Prime Directive to free them and reveal to the Hellemnites that the tower is just advanced technology, which requires no sacrifice. They retrieve the map piece and next clue before being informed that Mal and Locke have been found. Meanwhile, Culber receives help from Stamets as Book as he struggles to come to terms with the impact of the shared body experience on his spirituality.
So, guys, this episode brought a lot of interesting concepts. I love the idea of the Whistlespeak with this race. I think there was some a little bit of interesting change in how they dealt with the Prime Directive. I felt like in this episode too, and just a lot of directions that I really liked, and I actually kind of like it whenever we get a little Tilly Burnham together too, because it's always fun, and I like the fact we got a little bit of focus on Tilly in this episode. But what were your guys' initial thoughts of this week's episode of Discovery? Amy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, this episode was just meh for me. However, now that we're recording it on a Tuesday, I've had time. I've watched it 3 times. I've listened to some podcasts, and I watched it again today, again with subtitles, which always improves the watch. I'm really liking this episode. It still is like in the slump part of the season because I feel like it's got to get ramped up and get going to answer these questions. So I feel like I'm just in this little lull of the season, which is appropriately so. We don't have to always be so exciting. So we get this little story, a nice little away mission, a nice little, because every captain needs their, oh, I'm not a god moment. Kirk's had it, Picard's have it, Cisco, is it, being prophet and all. But so they each get their own. And so now we have Burnham who's getting her, oh, I'm not a god, don't worry. Even Pike got it in New Eden. So it's a nice, very typical good Star Trek story. And I'm sure it's going to be one that we come back because it's so unique, like Darmok or, these little away planets that it's like, it doesn't build on the story, but it's going to be an episode that we remember.
Now, guys, I wanted to show you something real quick. I have actually a pad of 21st century paper right here. And you guys, it's a whole other podcast to explain the story of how I managed to actually get this. So I just had to show off a little bit here. So, Haley, what were your thoughts on this week's episode?
So, I liked this episode. It was slower paced, which was actually really kind of nice. And I liked that it was not necessarily on the ships or in space for most of the episode. It wasn't flashbacks of people on a planet. And I liked being able to see how they would put Discovery's spin on handling the Prime Directive. What do we do when we deal with a race that's pre-warp? And how are we going to handle that? I loved, the perplexity of we have a tube of distilled water. And then distilled water? And I'm like, coffee pots, teapots, hello, humidifiers, distilled water. Anyway, and so I liked that it was something so simple that was being really complicated. And they weren't quite sure how to handle that. And I loved the storyline on the planet. I think it's wonderful. So I think even though it was a slower pace and not so much action, I actually really like that because that's part of what I love about Trek 2 is the slower paced. Can we talk to people? Can we learn something from them? Not go, 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 fight, fight, fight. kind of stuff. And I think we've had so much of that in Discovery. It's kind of nice to take like a breather, which is really funny given that, they can't breathe in this planet because of all the sand and everything. So, and the race that they have. So I really loved a lot of the concepts in this episode, and I think it was well done.
I agree. I think they handled this is one of the better Prime Directive episodes of Star Trek that I've seen, in my personal opinion. How they handled it, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But two, the other aspect of it is, yes, Amy, I agree with you. It feels like, okay, this is the classic Discovery problem. It's like, okay, we're getting to a few episodes left, and we still have a lot to deal with, and then you're giving us this slower episode here, but in this case, because, as much as everybody knocks Discovery in a way for being the Michael Burnham show, episodes like this, Sonequa Martin Green just shines. And she was so wonderful in this episode, as was Mary Weissman in this. And I liked other little moments of this, like the fact that Adira they talk about her being, they being on the bridge. This and how that it was Raynor's idea, that they had suggested, and Raynor's like, and Raynor's was on Adira. It's like, no, you can't fold now. You wanted this, finish it out. And I really loved that moment. I loved seeing Raynor being a little bit more, as he's becoming more working with the crew and changing his ways a little bit, but still pushing them in his own way. And I really like that moment. And it's always interesting to me too. What I thought was very interesting was how they handled the God aspect of it in this, because I think they handled it in a way I haven't seen Star Trek handle it in a good while. And it felt very respectful, and yet still it didn't feel like, sometimes when I've seen in my least, I feel like sometimes with Star Trek, when they handle religion, it still feels like there's a little bit of heavy-handedness in here. And this really felt like they were very gentle and respectful about it, Amy.
Yeah. Just as you were saying that, I really feel this episode wraps things up nicely with this spiritual and scientific, because we're getting the religious aspect, obviously, with the compeers trying to get to, and worship and sacrifice, like that's their religion. We're getting it in Culber, where he's talking to his abuela and saying, she had this great religion. She should be giving me answers. And him dancing, toying with the idea, from last week's little conversation with Tilly of, spirituality, and then looking at it through a scientific lens. Like Burnham is pointing out, hey, this is technology. This isn't your God. And Culber is getting it. Well, talking to his abuela is like, well, I taught you to be a scientific man. So, go run some scans, So both storylines are running this parallel spirituality versus scientific. And I'm really along for the ride because, like you're saying, Kyle, it is done respectfully. And even Rava's father was like, well, if you're not a God, does that mean, and God didn't build this, does that mean like there's no God? And Burnham's like, well, I can't answer that. All I can say is this right here is technology. So don't lose your faith. I think that's sort of what we can tell people, like, you use science. The fact that the Earth travels around the sun, like we're not traveling around God. It doesn't ruin your spirituality. It may ruin your religion, and that's a whole nother story. But your faith and belief in God should coexist with science. Like, that's what I feel this episode really does well.
Haley, any thoughts?
No, I completely agree. I was going to bring that up. So I'm glad that you did, Amy, because I think, it is a difficult subject when you want to talk about that, because, okay, does that mean that all these beliefs I had, all these feelings, these viewpoints that I've had my whole life, are they just non-existent? Do they need to be completely altered and changed? And not necessarily. And so I think it's very much, like in Culber's case, he goes in and he does this neuroscan and hey, everything's fine. Like everything internally in your body is fine. And so maybe it is something where you are wondering about a change. We've never really explored with Culber of what his beliefs are, what his religion would be per se. And so I like this journey that we're on with him of kind of learning like, okay, maybe he never really had a lot of spirituality because of the science, or maybe he did and then he lost it at some point, and maybe that's going to be him getting back to it. Because you can have both, and they can inform each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really wonderful. And I mean, I was thinking about it with Culber. I'm like, well, yeah, I'd run through like the steps. Okay, let's see, is there something physically wrong with me? Okay, if there's not something any physically wrong with me, obviously it is something emotional. It is something that isn't measured on scans and whatnot. And so I really like this idea that, he's going to be looking inside himself for the thing that he has apparently felt he was missing until he had the experience where he was joined. And that has brought him more. So I like this idea of, when they encountered and they brought up, no, this is technology. These people were trying to save you. And I love how Burnham explains it, that, the Denobulans came and they didn't view themselves as gods. It was compassion for fellow beings in this world. And they wanted to make sure that they were safe. And I think sometimes that can be your spirituality, your compassion, your empathy for others, and that love for your fellow human is really important. Mm-hmm. So I loved how she explained that to him, that can be it. It is, mm-hmm. They wanted to make sure that you were safe. And I will probably talk about it. I really want to know if they fixed the other ones.
we will get into that, and we're going to get into our prime points of this episode here shortly. But first, guys, I'm going to teleport in because I found some interesting Star Trek trivia. So going through and doing some deep research into this, I found a couple of interesting things trivia-wise that have come up out of this episode. First and foremost, Denobulans, the scientists who created the weather towers for the Highland Nights, was named Hiroshi Creel, a Denobulan. Though we never see him on screen, we know generally some basic features of what Denobulans look like. The beloved character of Dr. Phlox in the series Enterprise was a Denobulan, and it was in that series that nearly all of the lore of the planet Denobula was established, even though the planet was never seen on screen. Outside of Enterprise, we've seen Denobulans in Lower Decks, Prodigy, and briefly in Strange New World Season 2. Despite being mentioned in the Discovery episode, no Denobulans appear.
Such a bummer. They could have at least pulled him up like a hollow of his image or something like that. Or her. Could be her. Yeah, I was super excited because, I'm just starting to watch Enterprise. So I'm like, hey, that's Phlox's species. Woohoo.
Something else interesting, and I'm so glad that they finally kind of referenced this again, was, as they call it, Burnham's job. While it's easy to forget what Burnham trained to do for Starfleet, this episode reminds us of the fact that in season 1, it was established that in both Starfleet and at the Vulcan Science Academy, Burnham studied xenoanthropology. She's actually perfect for an away mission like this because of her anthropological background, unlike, say, several other Starfleet captains who frequently would go on a mission like this. I loved this touch because I know how much they played this up, especially early on in those early episodes of Discovery, and I was so glad that they've kind of brought that full circle in this episode.
Yeah. Well, it's like you would pull the people who are skilled at the particular thing that you're needing to look at on the planet, or, duh. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like, again, as you said, that was a big point when she, was transferring on Shinzo and Discovery, like that was her job. She's going to figure out the Ripper character.
Yeah, the Tardik.
Yeah. So again, this is just a perfect season to be the final season because we're getting these pullbacks to the very beginning, and it just makes you think of it. And and I love how creative and outside the box, and because sometimes you're just, banging your head against this wall. It's like, this is distilled water. There is nothing else. What else can we do? And then it was beautiful.
So the next one I have, we talked about this a little last week because it does feel like Discovery might be laying some ground pieces for what will be the Starfleet Academy show. We saw the ISS Enterprise last week. Maybe that could be something that is used in the Starfleet Academy show. But we call this trivia piece we could really use you at. Ever since season 4, Tilly has been teaching at Starfleet Academy, which for now is located somewhere at Federation HQ. Tilly telling Burnham she wants her to teach there too is interesting, as she and has some precedent in various Star Trek lore. When Spock was teaching at Starfleet Academy in The Wrath of Khan, he brought Kirk in to help out at the beginning of the movie. Because Tilly and Burnham are both from the 23rd century, initially, it's not too nuts to think of them both teaching at Starfleet Academy at some point in the future, much like their classic era colleagues across space and time. All I'm saying is easy setup for a Michael Burnham guest appearance on an episode of Starfleet Academy.
Although in this episode, I got the feeling Tilly is, because she kind of talks about it, that she's not sure if the Academy and teaching of the Academy is for her.
Well, I think that's been something they've kind of been playing up for a few episodes now, because she talks about how she just doesn't feel like she's connecting with the recruits. So I'm curious to see.
Well, she can't take them all on an abandoned planet,
Yeah, that's true. Ice planets crash a shuttle. That doesn't.
Yeah.
Now, the last piece of trivia I found is especially for Haley, who is our big TOS fan around here. Paradise Syndrome Reloaded. Overall, the story of Whistlespeak feels like a modern update of the tricky TOS episode, The Paradise Syndrome. In that episode, Kirk lost his memory and became part of a tribe of Native Americans who lived on a planet that was not Earth. Progressive stuff for 1968, maybe, but less than great or thoughtful now. However, the sci-fi premise of the Paradise Syndrome was fantastic, even if the politics were iffy. A device that was placed on the planet by any advanced alien race designed to protect the people of the planet malfunctions and gains religious significance. This is exactly what happens with the weather station on Palamno. And just like Kirk and Spock had to go back to the obelisk in TOS to save the native population, Burnham and Tilly have to do the same thing in this Discovery episode. Interestingly, this Paradise Syndrome connection goes even deeper when you realize the preservers mentioned in the episode were the first indication that an advanced humanoid species seeded several planets with humanoid life forms. So without the Paradise Syndrome, you don't have the TNG episode, The Chase, and without that, you certainly don't have Discovery Season 5's epic search for progenitor tech, which goes all the way back to 1993 or 1968 or millions of years in the past, depending on your point of view.
It's an interesting thought. Although this episode, I think really the only big thing in this episode that they did it better with Discovery compared to the Paradise Syndrome is that Kirk believes he's of the tribe. Mm-hmm. Tilly and Burnham know that they are not. And so in that regard, this was definitely a better way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I like the connection. That's cool.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that one. So,
no.
I want to give a shout out to our friends over at Den Geek for helping me find some of this good trivia here. But guys, let's get into some of our main topics for this episode. And the first and foremost one is the Prime Directive. Obviously, this is really the first episode of Discovery that has heavily dealt with the Prime Directive. And we talked a little bit about it earlier. I just think they handled it so beautifully. And in a way, I don't think I've ever seen a Star Trek captain handle it like Burnham handled this. And Amy, Haley, especially, there was one scene in particular, though. It made me think of the Orville. You know which one I'm talking about?
Mm-mm.
Uh-uh.
When they beam him up to Discovery and he's looking down on the planet. Do you remember the up-down episode of the Orville where they beam the one young lady they bring her up onto the Orville, and she's experiencing a starship for the first time.
They didn't beam him up, though. Burnham just had her thing, and it was a projection of his planet from above.
Yeah. It's just still very reminiscent of that Orville episode. But I was like, wait a minute, I know I've seen this somewhere before. But it just, I think, again, we talked about it earlier, Burnham just handled this with such respect and without destroying their belief system and making him think about that he wasn't wrong for still having that belief system. Just there's other things out there. And I just go back to it was like the lightest hand I've ever felt like Star Trek has ever dealt with religion and how the Federation would affect a race's religion.
I think with this, though, what's massively different from all the Prime Directive episodes, that should be a topic we should do in comparison of how it's handled. Anyway, is that this was Burnham, and it was just kind of like their high priest. It wasn't, sometimes we'd see in TNG or in TOS, it was a large group of people where, the Prime Directive was violated and in front of a large amount of people. This is just one person. And I think that has the greater impact, so to speak, because now he knows the truth. And, as Burnham says, others in his people are willing to kind of change and not say, hey, we need to run this race and sacrifice, which I honestly was not expecting that. I didn't think it was going to be, whoever won the race had to sacrifice themselves. I didn't think that at all. And so, we don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. But now that you know the truth, you can continue your religion, your spirituality, and change it how best to change it for your people, but also not change it as much as you need to, because he's really the only one that knows the truth. Culber, they left before, his daughter woke up. So she never even saw anybody else other than, her father and Tilly and Burnham. And so, that secret is kept safe in one person, to change his people how he sees fit. And I think that was really powerful.
Yeah. And I think, excuse me, I don't think it's really a true breaking of the Prime Directive, because they're repairing something that an alien race did way before them. So they're fixing something that should have never been there in the first place. The Denobulans were the one breaking the Prime Directive. I mean, they didn't have one, so it's not breaking, but you know what I'm saying. So it was their duty to fix it, I feel, and I hope that they did fix all of them. I mean, if they had to teach, them, well, it will need repairs, so we're going to teach you how to do it, then they could do that to all of the other 4 towers. But again, I don't think that those towers should have ever been there if the planet is not naturally habitable. Like, it just, I don't know.
But it must have been, because the Denobulans went there and they saw the people were there. So, they were already there and they wanted to have compassion upon the people. So in some capacity, they must have been there. And maybe these storms, I think, as they were saying earlier in the episode, that they've just gotten worse over time. So, maybe perhaps it was something like there was a desert area, kind of like we have the Sahara, and it just got worse and worse, and it got drier. And then the Denobulans came and they wanted to make sure that these people didn't completely lose their planet. So, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Adira did say that she ran a reverse linear regression. So, and I remembered that.
You talk about the other towers. I could have sworn Adira said something about once they fixed one, it would send a signal to the other ones that would make them adjust.
I hope so.
Along those lines. So
I wanted them as they were like pulling away to see the planet, and it, was getting greener and just expanding green. Anyway, that was just me. I just wanted that to have like that happy little ending on the end of it.
One of the other things, as far as what we saw in this episode, we have this elder who is, so believes in her people, and she's out there when she shouldn't even be out there, as they said, removing dust. And I just found something very powerful with this character, and just she drew me in every time she was on the screen, and you could see just the respect Burnham had for this woman as well. And I wanted to bring up the performance, and I wanted to just bring up that I loved what this character brought to this episode.
Well, I think she was representative of all the things that Burnham learned about their culture, was that they don't have a hierarchy. There's no social caste. In here, she's like proving that point where it's like, I didn't want to make someone work for me because I love my community, and so she's got this work ethic that's, supporting and bettering her community. So it was interesting to see, not only hearing the words, oh, this is who these people are, but seeing it. And that's what she represented to me.
Well, and it's neat to see that sometimes those who are ready for change and ready to change up your beliefs and your systems aren't necessarily always the young people. I love her story, Honora. I love her story, how she was talking about how her friend had won the race, and she wishes that her friend was there to be old with her and cheering on the younger generations, and being there and just being old people together, and I think about my bestie, and we send each other stuff all the time of how we're going to be like these old ladies that are just going to be like, everyone around us is going to be like, oh, what did they do now? And so, I like that it doesn't necessarily always have to be that, older generations are stuck. Sometimes they are the ones who are ready to see a change. And I think that comes with age and growth and saying, maybe it is time that we do things differently, because I wish so-and-so was still here for whatever reason. I loved her character too. I loved the scene where they took the Tibetan singing bowls, essentially is what those were, to get the dust out of her. And I thought that was so just neatly done. Like, I was not expecting something like that to be what they have discovered helps that. And I thought that was really neat.
Well, that is like amazing technology that we use now, like in medical, the sonograms and stuff. And like to break up kidney stones, they're using these waves, which here would be sound waves. Like it makes sense.
Yeah. It was so cool. I love that.
Yeah. It was cool. And that was one of my favorite parts, when they use that to push out the dust from her, because it's like, it just goes to show you that as great as our modern tech is, it still has a base that came from somewhere in basic technology and ideas. So I thought that was so well done. I included this shot. I talked about it earlier about reminding me of the Orville, but also Discovery is just one of the most beautiful shows I've ever watched. I mean, it's just stunning with the effects and everything that they've done. And guys, just you see this shot in particular with that sand effect, and then having this green spot like Jupiter's eye was just so well done.
It's hexagonal shape. It's like the storm on the North Pole of Saturn. That's what I saw anyway.
Hey, Haley just scienced this up again.
I'll be Rainer. And why does it have to be hexagonal?
Yep, probably.
Exactly.
I mean, it is like if you zoom in and you look really close, it's a hexagon. It's not circular. It's not an oval. It's a hexagon.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So that brings us, though, to our next topic. And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier as well, but I want to get into Culber, especially, and his quest with his spirituality. Now, I'm going to go back to last week's episode of Union Federation, where I talked about one of the things that kind of frustrated me with Culber in that episode was he started this and it was so short. They didn't mention his experience with being with the Trill and everything that happened there. And yet it made me very happy that they dove into this episode and talk about how much it really affected him. And one of the things that I love about it is the fact that I think, and it's what makes Culber so great of a character is, yes, he's a doctor, so he's a man of science, but he still has a strong spirituality within him, and his bond to the history of his family. We see that when he's using that program, and he's talking to his grandmother, and then his grandmother's talking about, well, I can't help you with the spiritual answer because I raised you to be scientific. But so when he goes to Paul with the scientific side, that's great. But then he has that great conversation with Book as well. But even I think Paul, it was one of the things I really loved about him is like, okay, so we know there's nothing wrong scientifically, physically. Just enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I love that coming from Stamets because, I mean, Stamets is always the scientific, must find the science, and to have him, what a moment of character growth for Stamets right in that moment.
Yeah, it really just proves how healthy their relationship is. I'm loving it. I love everything about it. And I would like to pop in about this amazing Abuela program that he's running now with AI. It is Gestalt had coined or, did this open chair or empty chair theory that has been used by psychiatrists for many, many years. I'm not sure when Gestalt was around, but this is the empty chair taken to the 32nd
the next level,
century,
literally.
So I think it is so helpful. I love that they're addressing mental health in the show. I love that they're bringing real life therapy strategies to the show and letting people say, you know what, you can talk to an empty space, a hologram in this situation, or an empty chair, and have these discussions because that's processing in your brain. Like, this is how you move through a stumbling block. And I love that they're showing it to us and that we're getting, more character development with Culber and his abuela. And I just want to say on the cruise, I have eaten mofongo with Wilson Cruz in Puerto Rico. It's one of my very favorite memories. So I loved seeing it on screen. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Just remember that wasn't the original recipe. They just replicated it.
Yeah.
I think what I was most happy about this is that he went and talked to Stamets, because you see that Stamets notices, in the last episode, something was bothering him. And if you have a really great relationship with a partner, you should be able to discuss anything. And I understand that, it was probably in part because Wilson Cruz, Dr. Culber, didn't know how to explain it. He wasn't even quite sure exactly what he was experiencing or not experiencing or how he was feeling about it. So he didn't have the words to necessarily put into an explanation. But at the same time, that's keeping, Stamets out from something that is impacting him. And so I loved that he was like, hey, can you help me do this thing? I'm kind of struggling, and he finally opened up as to what was going on. And I think also part of why is he was afraid. Stamets is very, kind of hard science. And this is kind of the fluffy science, soft science, essentially. And I really love this aspect that, Stamets is like, hey, let's take a look. And if it's not anything hard science, that's okay. We'll still figure it out and go forward. So like you said, Kyle, that Stamets was like, hey, it's all right. Be comfortable with it. Enjoy whatever it is that you are experiencing that has opened up for you. Be there for the ride. So there's a DBT skill and it's called Ride the Wave. And you're supposed to essentially ride the wave of the emotion that is present in the moment and just kind of go with it and allow yourself to experience what it is that you're experiencing in this moment. And and just ride along with it and see where it takes you and then process. And so it's very much, kind of what Dr. Culper's got to do is he's just got to go through this journey and see what this means for him. And then kind of go from there. And like you said, Amy, I loved this idea that Kovich has, come up with and Dr. Culber's testing out, because again, like one person can only listen and help so many people. And it really starts to drain you and affect you. And you've really got to have a team around you. And so if this is something, that could be put into practice in the 32nd century, then, I think that's a great idea. And I'm excited to see where this goes. And, and then, throwing in Book and him talking, to him about the same thing, like it's okay, take the journey where it takes you, and see what you're feeling, because if you can't describe it, then you're not even certain at this point either. And so you really don't know where you're at, which also then led into a wonderful little conversation of Book and Burnham, and one question at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I love that moment, and I love the symmetry of the fact that last season Culber was the one who was trying to help Book and trying to be there for Book at the end of the season and even through this season. And now you're seeing it kind of flipped, where the journey Book has been on is actually in a way helping him relate to Culber and help Culber through his journey. But the other thing that I really liked about this, and it's not a twist you see that use that often, because usually when somebody's having an existential crisis or having a problem emotionally, it's always with a sadness or a despair or something dark. And here, Culber's trying to understand this like feeling of good he's having and where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it so much more interesting, because it's coming from a perspective we don't see that often used by Hollywood, whether it's in a movie or TV. And I think the fact that they're using this feeling of good, and yet he's bring forth his questions, it brings a whole different perspective from it than if people necessarily worrying about him. Like you see Stamets, he's concerned because he wants to make sure physically everything's all right. But when he understands that, and he's like, well, you feel good. And even, it's just so nice to see it coming from that angle instead of one of a dark angle and just coming from a bad place.
Yeah, really good point, Kyle.
Mm-hmm. I almost wonder if, Dr. Culber, with what he's gone through and what he's experienced, if the reason that he's kind of having a hard time, with the after effects and whatnot of the joining, because I'm sure to some degree there are like those lingering emotions, not memories, but those emotions from the other person are still going to be there. And it imparts on, your brain and your neurons. I wonder if it's almost he doesn't feel that he's worthy of having those types of feelings because of what he's gone through, what he's had to witness with the crew of Discovery, where he died and he came back, and their feelings of their sadness. And there's a lot of processing, I wonder if he just hasn't done yet of what has gone on. And then he's been working on helping everybody else understand this jump that they've come through, and leaving everybody behind that they knew. Everyone that they knew is long gone, and so I wonder if there's this sense of guilt that he's guilty for feeling happy because of everything that he's gone through too, and so I almost wonder if that's kind of where that's coming from. But again, I think there's this element of we don't know what he spiritually believes. And granted, we don't know that of any of the crew, but people who are medical and science, tend to not necessarily have the deepest or the strongest. And so we don't know what his background was and his conflict with that. And so I wonder if that's also part of why he's struggling to name what he's feeling and know what to do with it, because he has a guilt for betraying the science because of whatever this is bringing about too.
I think that's a great great point, Haley, because I mean, he is a doctor, and the doctor, as a doctor, he's a man of science, but he keeps his mind open to the spiritual, especially when you're talking about the fact that he did die and come back. I mean, how that experience would change anybody is something we'll never know. But for him, maybe, it's like there's this been that sense of I came back and why, and now he's having this feeling of joy, and it's just like, and content, in a way, contentment, the way he describes it. And he's like, I don't get it. I don't understand it because I shouldn't be feeling this way, but yet he does. And I just want, I think, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but it really does feel like the spiritual journey that Culber is on is just as important as the journey that they are taking to find these clues for the progenitors. And I just see how these two things are going to be very important pieces of the puzzle once we get to the finale of the show when we eventually do find the progenitor's tech and what decisions could be made with it. And I think that's really going to be an interesting aspect, because I think that's the spiritual journey Culber's on versus the scientific is going to be a big part of that finale and that discussion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, as you're talking, Kyle, I remembered, Culber was very withdrawn when he came back, when they were able to bring him back, and, very down and things like that. And so, he's kind of felt that way even still, I think, despite everything that, he's been helping everyone and he enjoys that and he's finding joy. I think he still has those really darker emotions because of everything he's gone through. And so I think that's where that is. But I love this notion of, what are we going to find at the end? And how is everyone going to handle this aspect of, your beliefs now, knowing that you're finding the progenitors' tech and knowing that the progenitors were the ones who started everything and all life in the universe. How is that going to affect your beliefs and your values and your spirituality, your religion? Mm-hmm. And I think I will be sorely disappointed if they don't handle that well at the end. If it's just a little snippet thing of like just in passing, I will be very disappointed. If we don't see something of not necessarily massive struggle, obviously, because, we're 5 episodes in, we have 5 episodes left to go. But again, I think I said this last week, like I would love to see more of this discussion amongst the crew of like what this means for them. Because if they just dismiss it altogether or it's handled so quick, I will be very disappointed.
I think that's fair. It's going to be very interesting, as we've talked about many a time. It's the one thing bugaboo that Discovery has always seemed to have is how they handle the closeouts of their seasons sometimes. Yeah. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch how they handle this, because they are setting up some very powerful things in discussions that could be had. So we will be here for the ride of all of that. But guys, I am going to transport us into our second away mission. It's away mission number 2 here on the Union Federation podcast, which means it's time to talk the Ready Room, hosted by Wil Wheaton. And maybe the most interesting episode of the Ready Room this season, in my opinion, guys, because his guest was the one and only Alex Kurtzman, who revealed a lot in this episode, not only about the past and where Discovery has been and where it's at now, but also some talk of the future of Trek and what's going to be happening. Amy, I know you pulled several things from this episode.
Yeah, I was really excited to see Alex Kurtzman on the Ready Room. I was not expecting this. This is basically mid-season, and he did a lot of talking about sort of the past and mentioned quite a few of the shows coming up. I forget. We have a bright future. We were just so disappointed, the cancellation or, the wrap up of Lower Decks. But my gosh, Starfleet Academy, the Section 31, little movie, Strange New Worlds. Was very exciting to hear him talk about it. And over on All Good Things, we did a producers rundown, all the producers of Discovery. And it was so interesting listening to him, especially talk about Michelle Paradise, who is now the showrunner, and sort of the rough start that Discovery had, we know, with showrunners in the writing room to where we are now. And that was one thing I really loved is Wil Wheaton kept, talking about just how the 5 seasons have gone and where we started in 2017, where there was no Star Trek, and now to this beautiful future, and all because of Discovery. I thought it was a wonderful, wonderful episode, and I encourage everyone to go out and find it on YouTube or Paramount Plus.
Yeah, and for the record, this is 2 weeks in a row we have all watched the episode of the Ready Room. It's a Union Federation record, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. Yeah. Haley, what about you? Anything in particular with this interview grab out to you?
I'm excited to see, what the future shows hold for Discovery, especially with the news we had about, Sony and all that. And so I'm intrigued and I'm excited. And I will continue to tune in. I think my favorite thing, again, we got just a little bit of a snippet of, hey, costumes. And that was kind of nice. Like, that was nice to see that. Always nice to see how much detail they put into all the costumes. It's insane.
Yeah, the attention to the breen, when they were described, like the diagonal lines I was like, oh my gosh, I would have never in a million years.
Mesh and the mesh and the angles and what they took in it and everything like that.
Yeah, the tubing and oh my gosh, yeah.
I mean, I cross stitch and I crochet, and people applaud me for the cross stitch. And I'm like, that is nothing compared to the people who hand stitch and can come up with details for costumes like that. Cause I just boggles my mind.
And I'm sorry, but did you even notice any of that on screen? Or this gives the fabric more texture and colors, and then we hand dyed it, and then we silk screened it, and I'm just like, are you kidding me? And like seeing it up close, it's like, yeah, it's gorgeous, but on screen, I just feel so bad. I want to notice it, but well,
it's like the early, the early episodes when we had the. At STLV, we had the tour and they had the uniforms, and you finally could tell that, they were little deltas, on the shoulders and and down the sides. And you really, like, it didn't, when you were watching the episodes, it didn't look like that at all. It looked like it was solid. Mm-hmm. And so, I think there is some loss. And I think, unfortunately, it's due to a lot of the time the lighting. Mm-hmm. We've talked about that so much on the show about how dark it is, in comparison, and you do miss out on little details like that, like the fine details that I know probably take so much time and effort into making in these costumes, and they don't make just one.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of lost because you don't see it because it's so dark. And I get it. Space is dark, but the ships aren't,
right?
Yeah, if the Enterprise can be as bright as it is on Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing for me with this episode was I felt like this was actually a very important episode of the Ready Room for the fans, because I think the fans have been kind of like in this ether a little bit. And Amy, you can probably weigh in on this as well, of what is the direction of Star Trek, even though we know that Starfleet Academy was coming and we knew Section 31 movie was coming, with this being the final season of Discovery, with Lower Decks ending, and kind of been the uncertainty of the future of the Paramount in its own right. A lot of Star Trek fans I've talked to, while they're still excited about what's happening with Trek, there's been a little trepidation about the future, like what's going on here. And to hear it from Alex Kurtzman, who is way up there on the Star Trek hierarchy, I think it was kind of a bit of a reassurance for the Star Trek fans. Like, hey, we're not going anywhere. We've got plans. don't worry, we're good going forward.
Yeah, it was very reassuring. And one thing that I did really feel good about was the fact like he came in late to the game, and he was a fan, and he came in and is bringing, like he was saying, the production guy, and then bringing in Tunde for the director, and like he's bringing in people and like quality. And here he is the one with the expertise of doing both film and TV and the production. I mean, if you think about it, Paramount was like, all right, we'll give you a Star Trek. You'll have Discovery. It truly was him that kept going to the executives that got us more shows, period, hands down. Like the fact that we have that, we should be worshiping this man. Of course not, but giving him flowers and the praise for being the go-between between Paramount and us fans. And so it just was more evident to me that he loves Star Trek and is fighting for us to get more, to be outside thinking box person. And I'm loving where Star Trek is, and I'm loving where it's going. And I'm excited to see what more we get. I mean, look at all that he brought us, short treks. And I bet with the sale or that's coming in, like Sony or whoever's going to buy it, I wonder if they're going to reach in and grab Prodigy and bring it back under the umbrella, and that we'll have season 3 of Prodigy to be dealing with.
We can hope. I'm just ready for Netflix to put out season 2. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I think this was a very poignant episode of the Ready Room. And I think the most important one of this year by far. But guys, I'm going to warp us out of here. And it's time to intercept some subspace signals. Which means it's time to talk about the Orb of Prophecy, which is, of course, a look into episode 7, which I'm going to hope I'm pronouncing right as Erga.
Erga, I think.
Erga.
Right? Erga. Just a quick synopsis. With Maul and Locke finally in custody, the Federation is pulled into a diplomatic and ethical firestorm when the Bream arrive and demand they be handed over. Meanwhile, a frustrated Book looks for ways to help as Tilly, Adira, and Reno work to decipher the latest clue. All I'm going to say, a Reno Tilly team up, I'm down. I am ready for, and of course, too, a familiar face returns in this upcoming episode as well. So
that's really exciting. So I guess her time on the Seed ship is done, and she's done her home stuff and is back in Starfleet.
Yeah.
Remember, because that's where we left her off, right? Was that Seed ship?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see about that. But like I said, anytime we have gone too long without quality Reno time. So I am ready for some Reno in my life with next week's episode. But that is going to close out this week's episode of the Union Federation podcast here on the Fandom Podcast Network and BQN Networks. As always, thank you to my absolutely amazing crew. I'm glad I was able to spare you Whistlespeak throughout the episode. I think we'd be a little more parched than we already are from all the talking, but it's always, as always, it's a great and educational time podcasting with you two. I'm always learning something by the end of this episode, whether it's Haley is sciencing me up or Amy's giving me some Star Trek info I didn't even know about. But it's so much fun, and it's an amazing crew. Even though nobody will go clean up the P corner, that I can't say I really blame them. But yeah, Haley's giving me the look. Of course, we are on the Union Federation is on the Fandom Podcast Network, and you can, of course, can find the Fandom Podcast Network at our homepage at fpnet.podbean.com or on our YouTube channel at just look up the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. Please give us a like, subscribe, and share us out. We're constantly trying to grow our YouTube presence. And of course, you can find the Fandom Podcast Network on all your major podcast distributors, whether it's iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, it's all there. And of course, to our good friends over at the BQN, assimilating the audio across the internet. And Amy, are you starting to assimilate some YouTube at all, or are we there yet?
Yeah, we've got some shows on YouTube as well. Our Trexperts quiz, and when the view screen comes back in September, which is coming up pretty soon, and our Batleth battles are all live. And then so we're getting some live shows on YouTube as well.
They're going to assimilate us all soon. Heck, I think MySpace might be the BQN's next target to assimilate. I'm like, well, we're going to see what happens there. As always, we are talking this final season of Star Trek Discovery, the final adventures of Discovery. It's been interesting so far, and we aren't done yet. It has been a pleasure this week, guys. We hopefully brought a little bit of fun to your Trek lore this week, and able to share our thoughts on Discovery with you is always an honor. This episode was Whistlespeak for my amazing crew who just bring it every time, and we couldn't do this podcast without them. Thank you, and for everybody out there, thank you for listening, whether you're listening on the Fandom Podcast Network or the BQN Network. Until next time, hailing frequencies are now.